The C-130 rolled down the debris-strewn runway, staggered into the air, and shortly thereafter burst into flames. It hung on waveringly for a few seconds, dropping a wing, then crashed just over a hill. It was an unnerving thing for Lieutenant Colonel William Boyd, Jr. and his crew to watch, preparing to land their own Hercules on the same battle-torn strip. Now they figured their chances of getting in and out again were considerably slimmer, and they were mighty slim to begin with. The ground fire that downed the C-130 was more intense than anyone on Boyd's crew had ever seen. Naturally, they knew from the onset that the situation on the ground was critical, else they wouldn't have come here in the first place to help evacuate the Special Forces troops and Vietnamese civilians from the Kham Duc camp. Even so, they were still briefly dismayed by the incredible scene they beheld as they flew toward the field. They came in from the east, bouncing along just under the bases of several thunderstorms, cruising at 4,500 feet and dropping to 3,000 as they arrived over the base. Smoke rose in ominous columns from the Special Forces camp. 2 battalions of the North Vietnamese Army poured mortar, rocket, and heavy weapons fire into the camp as F-100s and F-4Cs fought back, bombing and strafing the enemy positions, many just outside the base perimeter. The sky was aswarm with aircraft, helicopters, C-123s, the fighter bombers, and O-2 forward air controller. Thick as flies, Boyd's co-pilot Major John W. Reed said. Because of the heavy traffic, Boyd's C-130, codenamed Spare 807, held a steady heading and altitude, finally turning on a high base leg to begin his approach to the strip. That's when the C-130 on the ground began its roll down runway 04. I watched him climb over a 1,550-foot hill off the end of the runway, Colonel Boyd said later. As he went over the hill, he seemed to be hit by more tracers than I've ever seen. They came from the right side of the hill, and it appeared to me that he caught fire in the air. Boyd watched as the C-130 crashed in a ravine beyond and to the right of the hill. I don't recall an explosion, only black smoke, Boyd recalled. And the sight didn't exactly increase my enthusiasm for landing. Still, the crew of Spare 807 knew they had to land. They could see 3 groups of Special Forces troops on the ground, apparently divided into airplane loads. Unless the C-130s and C-123s could get them out, they faced certain death or capture. Kham Duc is located near the border of Laos. It's in a valley, completely surrounded by hills, and it almost always has lousy weather. Today, May 12, 1968, Mother's Day, was no different. For 3 days, a cloud cover had made air support a risky venture, and the Special Forces camp had been constantly subject to heavy enemy ground fire. It was now about to be overrun, and the situation had been declared a tactical emergency. Surprisingly, when Colonel Boyd and his crew left Cam Ranh Bay early that morning, they only expected to spend the day flying regular supply missions. Nothing startling or even difficult was on their schedule. They made a stop at Quy Nhon, unloaded, then reloaded and departed for Hue. After Hue was Chu Lai, but a little engine trouble forced them to stop first at Tuy Hoa for maintenance. By 2:30 that afternoon, however, they arrived at Chu Lai. Their day almost over, they thought. Bill Boyd couldn't have even suspected that he was only about 2 hours from the greatest test of his flying skill and courage he had ever faced. Nor that his performance during that critical test would earn him the second highest award for valor, the Air Force Cross, from the United States Air Force. At Chulai, Colonel Boyd walked to the air control element to see its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Joe Brennan. He asked Brennan to radio Hilda, the Airlift Control Center, and tell them that he, Boyd, and his crew would finish their crew day in less than an hour and would soon return to Cam Bay. That's when they heard about Kham Duc. "What kind of shape is your airplane and crew in?" Brennan asked. "Good, both of them," Boyd replied. Brennan then told him he was to proceed to Kham Duc under a tactical emergency plan as soon as possible. Land, load as many troops as possible, and return to Chulai. As Boyd turned to leave, Brennan called out, "Good luck, Bill." Boyd rejoined his crew outside the Alcee, and they headed back towards the airplane. En route, they met a lieutenant colonel who had been shot down in his A-1E west of Kham Duc. Rescued by an Army chopper, he had just been returned to Chulai. Boyd told the rescued pilot that Spare 807 was headed for Kham Duc. "For God's sake," the pilot replied, aghast. "Stay the hell out of Kham Duc. It belongs to Charlie." With that encouraging word, Spare 807 took off from Chulai. It was a few minutes after 3 p.m. En route to the besieged Special Forces camp, Boyd reflected that he couldn't have picked a better crew. He even had an extra man on board, Tech Sergeant Earl R. Fonderwhite, Jr., an instructor flight engineer who was along to give Flight Engineer Staff Sergeant Harlan G. Johnson his proficiency check. His co-pilot, Major Reed, was no novice, nor was his navigator, Captain Felix D. Powers. And Boyd had the utmost confidence in the skill of his loadmaster, Airman First Class Samuel Kira III. It was good that his crew was tops. Before this day ended, they would need all the courage and skill they possessed. Colonel Boyd briefed them as best he could. He didn't know too much, but he covered procedures and what little he knew about the situation at Kham Duc. From intercepted radio messages between Hilda and the Kham Duc Combat Control Team, Tailpipe Delta, Boyd knew that there was a helicopter crashed on the primary runway and a bulldozer burning on the side of the strip. There was no way to get either off the runway because the enemy fire was far too intense. Tailpipe Delta had recommended that no aircraft land there, since only 2,200 feet was usable. Colonel Boyd put the more experienced Fonderwhite in the engineer's seat. He told the crew to try to remain calm and cool, and to do their jobs as professional as possible. He told them this is really going to be the proof of the pudding and the ultimate test of all our training. Over Kham Duc, Colonel Boyd side-slipped to get the maximum rate of controlled descent. It was about this time the ill-fated C-130 on the ground was beginning to roll. Loadmaster Caro reported a hit in the tail section of Spare 807, but no serious damage was done. Spare 807 now began its final approach. The crew could actually see enemy troops outside the perimeter fence on the south side, firing small arms at them over the heads of the passengers waiting pickup. Shortly after the first C-130 crashed, Boyd flared out to land. He could see automatic fire hitting the runway in front of him, puffs and spurts of dust marking each impact. Later, he learned that a 40mm rocket had exploded on the runway about 100 feet in front of his C-130, right where I was going to touch down. Several radio calls of "Don't land" and the C-130 that just took off has been shot down convinced Boyd to call for a go-around. "Would you believe," he said, "that everyone did exactly like it says in the book?" Once again, he swung the big Hercules around and started down. On his final approach, Colonel Boyd told his crew that there was a damn good chance we won't make it, but we're going to try anyway. He hadn't forgotten the hopeful faces of the men on the ground, noted as they went on the first try. Now he was on the ground, stopping short of the enemy fire on the far end of the runway. In the rear of the aircraft, Airman Caro opened the cargo door and ramp, helping the waiting troops get on board as rapidly as possible. Sergeant Johnson guided them forward and seated them. I could see firing all over the field and people rushing toward the aircraft, Caro said. I was hoping one of those mortar rounds wouldn't come whistling in. It didn't seem like the people were getting on fast enough, and when I turned my head to look out the left side, I couldn't believe my eyes. 2 Vietnamese women with little babies in their arms were heading straight for number 1 prop. Caro wanted to yell, but he knew he'd never be heard. He tried twice to jump from the aircraft, but was blocked by onrushing people trying to enter the C-130. All I could do was stand there and watch those people walk right towards the prop. With a profound sense of relief and no little amazement, Caro watched as the Vietnamese women walked directly under the prop, their short stature saving them from sure death. When they got everybody on board, Caro gave Colonel Boyd the word and the airplane began to move. As they got underway, Captain Powers, who was standing by the crew entrance door relaying reports of the loading to the pilot, resumed his normal crew position. He tried to contact Kham Duc's control unit for takeoff instructions, but had no luck raising them. Meanwhile, Colonel Boyd had already decided not to take off on runway 04, the one that took the first C-130 over the hill to its destruction. Rolling onto runway 22, he taxied as far as he could without running into the heavy enemy fire, hitting the runway in front of him. He turned the Hercules around, then immediately began the takeoff roll. Major Reed was calmly spinning his computer wheel, telling me, "We had enough runway to get off," he said. Boyd then called for a maximum takeoff effort and a heading Captain Powers had plotted through a ravine to the left. It was some takeoff. As they rolled down the runway, they took several hits from 50 and 30 caliber machine guns. But even so, Boyd later said that considering what the communists fired at them, it was a wonder they didn't take more hits than they did. In fact, it was a miracle they made it off at all. The critical nature of the takeoff was best described, however, by a man who wasn't even in the C-130. He is Major Thomas E. Walters, who was leading a flight of 2 F-4Cs. His flight, Boxer 07, was scrambled from quick reaction alert status in order to fly close air support. As I rolled in on my first gunnery pass, I saw Spare 807 departing on runway 22, Walters said. It was receiving extremely heavy ground fire, small arms, and automatic weapons, and appeared to be in the right bank and then reversed to the left. This allowed him the best terrain masking and shielded him from some ground fire. Major Walters pressed his attack against the enemy firing at Boyd's C-130, noting suddenly that blue puffs of smoke were coming from the Hercules' left wing and fuselage. His left wing dropped, and he appeared to be going in, Walters said. However, the nose of his aircraft appeared to lower, the left wing came back up, and he continued to fly. If Spare 807 had not used terrain masking, had not applied immediate and correct responses, he could have lost control of his aircraft. The F-4C flight commander also took note of the C-130 that had been destroyed taking off on runway 04. He said Colonel Boyd's decision to use runway 22 allowed Spare 807 to make it out of Kham Duc. Even so, I can't understand how they got out without 100 pounds of lead in that airplane. Major Walters left no illusion about his reaction to the performance of Spare 807's crew that day. As a tactical fighter pilot, I am extremely proud to say I am on the same team. Colonel C.L. Balch, Boyd's boss and commander of the 50th Tactical Airlift Squadron, couldn't have agreed more. In his recommendation for the Air Force Cross, he credited Boyd's crew with evacuating 85 U.S. military troops and 15 Vietnamese civilians, some with infants. An examination of the aircraft at Chu Lai revealed that it had taken small arms and 50 caliber hits in the sides, tips, and wing leading edges. The professionalism, skill, and complete disregard for personal safety displayed by each crew member under conditions of intense automatic weapons, mortar, and rocket fire, coupled with low ceiling and decreased visibility, in extremely rugged terrain in close proximity to the hazards of primary and secondary explosions from friendly forces, and with a minimum of control tower supervision, resulted in saving of many lives, Colonel Balch wrote. Through this extraordinary heroism, superb airmanship, and aggressiveness in the face of the enemy, Colonel Boyd, Major Reed, Captain Powers, Sergeant Fonderwhite, Sergeant Johnson, and Airman Caro reflect the highest credit upon themselves and the United States Air Force. Nobody on Spare 807 breathed easily until the Lucky Hercules reached 3,000 feet and began the trip back to Chu Lai. Even that flight was not totally uneventful, however. On the way back to Chu Lai, the bleed air duct, creased earlier by an enemy bullet, ruptured and blowing insulation throughout the cargo compartment. This was followed immediately by dense smoke. An emergency was declared, and at Chu Lai the aircraft was parked clear of the refueling lines. Engines and electrical power were cut, and the passengers immediately evacuated. Sergeant Johnson then masterminded the field repair of the bleed air system. Finally, it was all over, and the crew prepared to take off for their home base at Cam Bay. They arrived at 7:30 p.m., completing a 16-hour and 20-minute crew day. Before they left Chu Lai, however, Major Reed found a can of spray paint and sprayed Lucky Duck on the fuselage next to the crew door. The troops they had taken out of Kham Duc then cheered as they rolled down the Chu Lai runway.